The parameters mentioned in the prior segment exist in all EQs, but not every EQ will give you the option to play around with them. The EQ I was using is called a parametric EQ. Parametric EQs let you determine the center frequency, amplitude, Q, and sometimes even more parameters, as we just saw with the FabFilter Pro Q. The more classic form of a parametric EQ will use knobs, and will do the same trick looking a bit different. Another type of EQ is the semi-parametric EQ, which lets you determine the center frequency and amplitude, but not the Q. Oftentimes, the Q varies as the gain of the frequency changes, but this is predetermined by the designer. A third type of EQ is the graphic EQ, which will give you a set amount of bands on a set amount of frequencies that you can either boost or attenuate to taste. Like the semi-parametric EQ, the Qs are predetermined and either change with the volume manipulations or stay the same. Dynamic EQs react to the incoming audio and don't stay completely static. This feature is great since the effect of an EQ move isn't necessarily right throughout a whole song. So dynamic processing might save a lot of automation work, which we will be talking about in a different segment. Linear phase EQs are a potential solution to a side effect that sometimes appears from the traditional EQ design. Most of the EQs you'll meet are minimum phase EQs, which implies that they have slight time delays, which in turn introduce slight phase shifts that vary by the frequency, filter type, and gain. This is called smearing, and it's more likely to happen when using intrusive EQ moves like very narrow cuts or high-pass, low-pass filters. When smearing is not desirable, linear phase EQs come in handy because they keep everything in time, therefore preventing phasing issues. The downside is that they create higher latency than other EQs and might soften transients. So this tool has its virtues and trade-offs. Use it when needed, but know the consequences. When it comes to analog EQs or emulations of analog EQs, we need to understand that a big part of the EQ's character comes from its circuitry and design. Some EQs have tubes in their circuitry and give the audio a bit of tube saturation. Some are solid state and as a result are very clean. Some have very colorful transistors that give them their own unique tone. Although modern EQs are practically limitless, classic EQs are still in the forefront of mixing for a good reason. With that in mind, I want to show you a few classic EQs you will surely see a lot as you dive deeper into mixing. I'll explain their logic since some of them are not too intuitive, but before we start, I want to introduce you to a few basic symbols that will help you get around a new EQ even if you're not familiar with it. This sign marks a bell-shaped filter. This marks a low shelf, this is a low cut, this is a high shelf, this is a high cut, and this is the phase flip sign. Let's start with the SSL parametric EQ. This is a British EQ that has 4 bands, which in the default forms are low shelf, high shelf, and 2 mid-range bell bands. Some emulations will have only one low-cut filter and some will have another high-cut filter as well. The 2 mid-range bell bands have a Q knob to them, making the EQ fully parametric, and the high and low shelves have a button that can turn them to bell filters instead of shelves with predetermined Q. Here's the SSL in action. Miss my evening strolls. 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 The next classic EQ is the Neve 1073. This semi-parametric EQ is also British and is very famous for being a part of countless influential records that we are all familiar with. This EQ has high and low shelf bands, one mid-range bell band, and a high-pass filter. The frequency of the high shelf is fixed at 12K. The low shelf has 4 selectable frequencies. The mid-range bell band has 6 frequencies you can choose from with a fixed Q. An interesting thing to know about this EQ is that the low-cut filter has a bit of resonance to it, which will add a small boost at the chosen frequency point. This can be used to fatten up a source while still filtering the really low frequencies. Another classic Neve EQ is the 1081, which has one more bell band in the mid-range, more frequencies for each band, two Q options for the mid-bell bands, as well as the option to change the shelf bands to bell, and finally a high-cut filter. Here are the 1073 and 1081 in action. Miss my evening strolls. 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 The next EQ is the API 560 Graphic EQ. This is an American EQ with 10 bands jumping in octaves, meaning that the frequencies are doubled from one band to the next. The Q narrows as the boost gets more extreme, giving this EQ a very musical and pleasant sound. This feature will also be found on API's semi-parametric EQs, which are the 550A and 550B. You might have noticed that the 550B has another band, but the frequencies on the two EQs are also slightly different, so they will be serving different purposes. They both give the option to change the high and low bands from shelf to bell, and the 550A also has a bandpass filter, cutting anything below 50 Hz and above 15K. The frequencies are chosen using the inner blue knob and the gain by the outer white knob. Here are the API 560 and 550 in action. The last classic EQ will be the Pultec. This tube EQ was designed in 1951 and became a classic because of its unique tone and features. The low frequencies can be manipulated with two shelving filters that attenuate and boost simultaneously, therefore creating a unique filter shape that cannot be achieved otherwise. The next band is bell-shaped and can be used to boost selected frequencies between 3 and 16K. This band also has a bandwidth knob, which is the Q. You can adjust the bell to be very sharp or very broad as desired. Finally, there's a high shelf that can only be used for attenuation. This weird-looking, unintuitive EQ was a big part of some Beatles and Motown recordings, as well as countless other historical productions. Here's the Pultec in action. There are many more EQs to learn about, but these few are a good introduction into the analog EQ world. You don't need all these EQ types if you want to start mixing. Stock plugins are generally more than enough. The emulations are more fun to use, but have nothing to do with acquiring skills as a mixer. That being said, they are interesting as they have helped in developing the art form as we know it, so familiarity is useful. Now I want to present two tasks, one for this segment and one concluding the EQ topic.